Beloved, this is important work. This is holy work. The decisions we make today impact our tomorrows. The decisions we make today impact our future generations. This challenging work, these hard and holy conversations that you all will be participating in, will help break the hold and the bondage of the cancer and the sin of racism that has affected our churches, our nation, our families for far too long. God is looking for God's sons and daughters of all ethnicities and colors and languages to be able to live out what it means to be in beloved community.
When I came kicking and screaming. So I need to say that. I came kicking and screaming. I had thought about joining the group, I had bought the book, I had read some of the book, but I wasn't certain that I could have any type of impact on something called racial reconciliation. So there's the one chapter in this book that says, I'm Black, I'm Methodist, I'm fighting for racial reconciliation. And what that meant to me was I need to be the change I want to see. So even though I came kicking and screaming, during these conversations that we had, and peeling back the onion, peeling back the mask, taking off the mask, and being honest with each other about our feelings and some of the disparities that we have witnessed for ourselves or that has happened to us in our our personal lives and our careers. In order for the churches to open up and make some real changes, we all have to first admit that there is something that needs to be changed. We have to own what we are doing wrong. We have to own those things that are ingrained in our churches, that are ingrained in our denominations, that may turn off other people. So if we want racial reconciliation, we have to be racial reconciliation.
And for me, it was the discussion around racism. And we talked about personal racism versus institutional and systemic racism. And that was the conversation that I found most compelling, because first of all, it was clear that we had to work really hard to define what we were talking about. But then when we moved kind of to the discussion of institutional racism versus systemic racism, there was some different views on what the two types of racism were. And we ended up landing on the idea of institutional racism in the context of the church. And one of the things it seemed as though we still have some work to do from both local churches and from our denominations was being able to name how our own local churches and our denominations are still engaged in institutional racism. And that's often not even a thought within the AME Zion Church in terms of how we engage in institutional racism. Oftentimes that's projected only onto the white church. And certainly there is institutional racism in the white church, but it also exists within the Black church. So we have to be willing to discuss that.
In many ways, the book group built for me, or our conversations built on the conversations from the fall. So it was sort of there was new material to read and discuss, but the underlying dynamic for me continued to build. And I found myself on the one hand, impacted more than even in the fall with just the awareness of how awful racism is and how the extent to which it has damaged every single African American's life and continues to do so on multiple levels, given what's going on in our society. But the chapters in this book all address that. And what I've been looking for over the past months are accounts by white people like me who think back on the racism that they have been part of, or that they have witnessed, or that they have been aware of over the course of their life. And maybe you all can help me. There doesn't seem to be much out there. But that's what I'm wrestling with right now is, so where was I in all this, and where have I been, and where do I want to be, and what can I do? And that dynamic link between the personal experience, which is so eloquently written about in this book, and the systemic level, where we have trouble sort of seeing what we can do systemically, or what we can do on the great stage, is something I continue to wrestle with.
Women in ministry have a long way to go, and Black women suffer the reality of not being taken seriously as leaders in most major denominations. And it's really hard for them to be perceived that way. And what the author talks about is the reality of having to face society from a spiritual perspective, knowing what Jesus had advocated and what we expect, and yet seeing it fall so short of that. And so the thing that we grieve is seeing the inequities and not being able to solve the problems, and not seeing much progress from year to year. And so I identified very strongly with the author's perspective at the end that we're free. We're free in Christ. We're free to believe that Christ's day of justice will come, that we will become partakers in the reality of equity from a racial standpoint, as well as from a sexual standpoint, and that we will all be able to share in that. But part of that comes at the suffering of grief. And sometimes grieving helps us to embrace the reality of where we are. And it helps us to understand that God offers more. And we just have to go through the grief of carrying the inequities and believing that God will bring about a change, and helping to bring about that change by sharing our stories with others who are part of our journey, who believe that Christ will bring about a change, even in our time, and being patient as we go through the grieving process. So the discussions that we had gave me hope that even in my grief, that we will get to a point where we'll all be free as we learn and grow together in Jesus Christ.
I think it was chapter 10 that really brought things together for me in a new way. And I found a new level of energy in the discussion between the participants, which the Vance Ross, who is the pastor from Atlanta who wrote this chapter, asks us to be clear about the mission of the church, and whether our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ, or to reproduce those of our own kind, whether that is racial, theological, political, whatever identity component of our identity we most gravitate towards. And this distinction between the mission of Jesus Christ and what we often confuse as the mission of the church, I think really pushed the conversation to a place where I felt we were all able to be open and vulnerable in a new way to why we even have these discussions in the first place. And so there were so many things about these discussions that were meaningful for me as we continued to build trust and strengthen the relationships that we have begun. But it was really this return to the focus of the mission of Jesus that has inspired me to think in new ways about what is possible between our congregations.
Discussion was the ability, like any book club, even with Zoom, to be to have a camaraderie and to be willing to talk about what was on our mind, even if it wasn't in that chapter. And to me, that helped me to learn from our friends at Lomax, and hopefully vice versa. Just what our concerns of the day were, because we went through some really tumultuous times during this book period.
He says, if you're going to be a bridge, you have to be strong, because it means you're going to be walked on. By this, he didn't say that people won't respect you and will walk all over you. What he was saying is that if you're going to be a bridge, you must be willing to carry the weight, the fear, and sometimes the confused and frustrated navigation of people who are trying to move from one side to the other. People who are bridges sometimes face lack of understanding from people on both sides of the chasm they're trying to seek to bridge. And I guess that's where I feel like we are now, is learning how to be bridges and what that means.
Is sort of a context to the time that we've been interacting with each other. And that started in 2020 in terms of focused efforts on racial reconciliation. And it bears repeating that in 2020 was the killing of George Floyd and the summer of social unrest and the election in the fall. And so in our lifetime, certainly those who were born in the 60s or later, we haven't had this type of an environment. And I am so excited about what we've experienced as two congregations. But I have to admit, I also grieve the fact that because we're in such a heightened sense of racial awareness, I honestly expected our congregations to more fully participate in what we were doing. And so to me, it tells me that there are some people who don't want to engage in this discussion. Now, granted, there are many reasons why people don't participate, especially the busyness of life. But if there was any time when this conversation was needed, it was this 2020, 2021 year. And so as we talk about us being a bridge, there are some people that are happy being on each side of the chasm, and they don't want to walk across the bridge, even if we're willing to do the work. And so before we can even begin to build the bridge, I think we have to awaken consciousness about why this matters, why it matters for us now and why it matters for the future in terms of our local churches, as well as our communities and our nation. So I'm excited about what we're doing, but we have a lot of work to do to engage people to want to do this work.